Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the third episode of the story, What If Naruto Was in a Modern World, in which Hinata was barely exposed to Naruto's constant belief in himself. Now in her mid-20s, she meets him again and discovers a crack in her careful wall of Hyuga perfection. To show your support, like and subscribe. Let's get this show going. Naruto begrudgingly cracked an eye open as the mid-morning sun seeped through the patio window and flooded his room. Groaning in misery, he now knew why Hinata had put in such ugly dark window treatment. "That's gonna go right back up," he half mumbled, shifting his weight in the ottoman under the heavy blanket and pulling it closer to him in an attempt to dive back into the bliss of sleep. Only his blanket wasn't cooperating. He shifted again only to be stopped by a strange, feminine mule. He blinked away the remaining sleep from his eyes and his back muscle spasmed painfully as he leaned his head forward to catch a better glimpse of what weighed heavily on him. His sleepy gaze met with a tousled mane of indigo hair. He stiffened in shock as it dawned on him that it was a person, and not a blanket. What? He scrambled his memory for a hint as to what had happened. Okay. I still have my clothes on. So does she. So far so good. He shifted a little more in an attempt to get the feeling back in his arm while trying hard to ignore the feel of her breasts placed dangerously close to mini Naruto down south. Oh right. He thought. He remembered now, Hinata had broken down in front of him. From what he knew about her persona, she would be severely humiliated if she realized she'd fallen asleep and he'd passed out under her while unknowingly snuggling for several hours. Minutes? He really wasn't sure what time it was. He could see the sun still rising in the patio and ignored the cramping in his lower leg as Hinata shifted again with a small and excessively feminine snore. A quiet chuckle escaped him. Hinata rubbed her cheek into his chest. The feel of something slimy made him pause and he was suddenly aware that his favorite shirt had been abused. His chest felt wet and sticky from her use of it as a handkerchief in her fit. He didn't want to think about how much snot, tears and drool been caked on it. He wasn't sure if he should save the shirt or burn it in disgust. Naruto was not experienced with that many women, unlike Kiba's vast and lengthy temporary track record, but he knew one thing for sure, crying was not attractive on a woman. It made them runny, sticky and mostly incoherent if Hinata was anything to go by. She had hiccuped apologies between wails for nearly an hour while she quietly worked out her problems. Well, that was an incorrect description, none of it had been quiet. It had been snorts, hacks and girly sniffles, but he had to admit that it had caused a different reaction in him compared to when Sakura cried. With his ex, he'd always felt uncomfortable, racked with a strange sense of guilt that he wasn't ready to face or admit to when she turned on the waterworks. But with Hinata, it had been very different. Maybe it was the simple fact that Hinata refused to let anything affect her, the constant push on herself to show she wasn't frail, to demonstrate her strength in character, her pride. The simple fact that the heiress had so publicly broken down had made him pay more attention to her body language. Her eyes had reflected so much emotion in the split seconds he had ordered her to look at him. It had tugged at his heart and felt the uncontrollable urge to pull her close to him and soothe that lost, lonely look that ravaged the pale lilac eyes. He had been struck by their beauty, the depth of feeling was endless, unspoken emotion brimming to break out and he wanted to be the one to make it happen. Naruto had trouble wrapping his head around Hinata's personas. Maybe Kiba had been right after all, women with memory loss were. Wait, what? Did I just say Kiba was right again? He felt a shudder of disgust crawl up his spine. It was rare when the dog owner was correct in anything and Naruto would openly admit to it. This was a secret for the Dark Ages, he'd kill anyone that ever found out he actually thought highly of the other idiot that made them a pair. He groaned as he finished the thought in his head. That was the final nail in the coffin, he really needed to get his head checked once this project was over and done with. He glanced down to the silent blob curled up under his chin only to realize that he had unknowingly begun to play with a loose strand of her hair while he tried to figure out how to get back to work without disturbing her. He shifted his weight slightly, testing how tightly wound around him she was, and found that she was only leaned on him. He could easily slip out from under him if he wished it. With far more trouble than anticipated, he managed to free himself without disturbing her. Careful not to wake her, he tiptoed around the ottoman and found a light blanket on his bed, covered the girl and sought out the abandoned cups of coffee on his precious graph table. By the feel of the ceramic, the coffee was cold and he wasn't about to make another pot, leaving just one solution to this little problem. Microwave, he thought happily. He dipped a finger in the black liquid for good measure and tasted it to see which had sugar in it. Not surprisingly, both lacked sugar. He grimaced, but he couldn't complain considering his host had brought them in with good intentions. He entered the kitchen and placed the mugs on the counter as he thought more on the design he had finally figured out and needed to contact Kiba again to set up the team and materials needed for this. It's going to be an interesting day. Angry White Boy Polka sprung to life from Kiba's pocket indicating his boss was calling. He hummed a few seconds before flipping it open, trying not to crack up. He remembered the day he picked that specific ring-tone to annoy Naruto and his reaction had been priceless, convincing him to keep it on a permanent basis. "Yes, my dear," he piped up, smirking. Naruto rolled his eyes and quietly cursed that stupid song he knew played when he called. "I got most of the designs figured out in my head. I need you to pick someone we both trust to deal with the Hyuga as a liaison since I can't be there and you'll be busy with our other projects," he added while sipping the newly reheated coffee. Kiba blew out the air from his cheeks and thought a moment. His brain was groggy from the lack of sleep. "What about Konohamaru?" he suggested. There was no objection at the other end of the line, so he assumed it meant it was a decent idea, but he needed to convince him. "He's your apprentice, might as well give him this job. He'd be extra careful considering it would be his first gig alone." He yawned out the last bit. "True. I'll call him then and set up a meeting between him and Hanabi." He didn't want to admit it, but Kiba had another great idea. "Damn it, at this rate I'm going to have to give him a raise." "You're gonna have to give me a raise if this keeps up, Naruto," Kiba added without thought. Naruto sputtered at the other end of the line when he swallowed his coffee the wrong way. "Are you okay?" he asked his boss with genuine concern. "For fuck's sake, I told you to stop reading my mind," Naruto coughed out, hitting his chest to clear out the liquid. Kiba blinked and shook his head, trying to avoid laughing. "Great minds think alike," he quoted. Naruto snorted, ignoring him. "What about Shikamaru? How's that little problem coming along?" He sipped his coffee again, careful to review the How to Drink for Dummies manual in his head. Kiba shrugged to no one and looked around the corner from where he was standing. He spotted the pineapple head leaning back casually, lost in thought over the particular issue. "Well," he started, "Shikamaru has a few ideas on tracking down who's stupid enough to try and steal our work. He's in there right now creating some program to crack through the defenses. I don't really know, to be honest, you'd have to ask him." He heard Naruto sigh miserably on the other end of the line. "This better not be super complicated. I have enough issues to deal with here already," he moaned out in complaint. Kiba raised a brow and smirked. "What did you do now?" There was a lengthy pause from the blonde and Kiba was a little concerned. "What did you do?" he repeated again. "Well, I know that, well, dot." He deadpanned and Naruto grumbled unhappily. "It's not necessarily something I did," he said dejectedly, "I'm just not sure how to deal with Hinata. She's remembering a lot of things from what I can gather, but I didn't know being her psychiatrist was part of the contract." He stared at his cup, his mind playing over all the things that had slipped out of her during her breakdown. There was a lot of hurt inside of her and he wasn't sure if he was the right person to deal with it all. "You're so fucking dumb," Kiba interjected. Naruto frowned and snorted. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means, you better get in her pants soon or I will. She just needs a good dicking." Naruto blinked and Kiba gave himself another point. "You're so crass." He grumbled, and that doesn't count towards that board. The blonde pinched the bridge of his nose in disbelief. Kiba snorted and disagreed quite adamantly. Totally counts. I bet you're pinching the bridge of your nose. He pointed towards the wall, imagining Naruto in front of him. The blonde refused to admit anything. No, you're completely wrong, he lied. That's not really the advice I'm looking for. The snort of disbelief irritated him. He was perfectly aware that Kiba was making fun of him. You know better than asking me for advice. Last time I checked, I didn't have tits and my hair wasn't pink. Kiba looked away from Shikamaru and smirked as Naruto busted out laughing. You're lucky Sakura didn't hear you say that. Pfft. She doesn't scare me. I never fucked her, so she has no pussy control over me, he casually added before he noticed Shikamaru crack his knuckles and bend over his laptop. Maybe you should just ask her, be a bit more assertive on why she's being so double agent. Just ask. Yeah, like, hey, I noticed you're bipolar, wanna tell me what's up? Naruto cracked up. Kiba made it sound easy. I don't think that's going to work. Kiba shrugged again. Never know till you try. I gotta go, boss. Shikamaru's about to get this show on the road and I want to see. He flipped the phone off before Naruto could even say goodbye. Shikamaru had spent the entire morning breaking through the walls of security layering the network of White Serpent Incorporated, the parent company of his new client's old IT company. To his dismay, the development had been at a snail's pace, but he had to take extra care and use more measures than necessary. Alerting whoever had set up the sophisticated blockades was not an option at this point if he wanted to solve this mystery. The lazy technician paused momentarily in his endeavors to lean back in his chair and stretched, relieving the tension that had accumulated in his shoulders. He heard Kiba talking to Naruto on the phone, giving some sort of half-arsed update that made him cringe. Dumbing this part down to his new boss was going to be difficult and a complete pain in the ass. Pushing the upcoming and unavoidable report away, he turned his gaze back to the monitor and started to pick apart what he hoped was the last layer of security. Troublesome. He mumbled as he ran into another blockage. Shikamaru had seen and created many unique firewall or security algorithm in his day, but this one took the cake. It was unbelievably robust in its entirety and he shook his head, acknowledging that his unseen opponent was worthy. Usually, once you broke through the first layer of security, getting through any following layers was simply a matter of following the same pattern used to break the first. Not this one. It was like a force screen, nothing in or out without its say-so. He narrowed his eyes in thought, chewing on the straw from his forgotten pop. He realized earlier that the trouble he was having wasn't in breaking the walls down, it was the fact that he had to constantly change the way he approached each successive layer of their network. It was almost like it had been created by multiple programmers, not just one. Shikamaru furrowed his brow and his fingers froze above the keys of his laptop. That's it, he thought as he slapped his forehead. He finished breaking the current layer before minimizing the screen and bringing up the source code he'd been copying as he went along. He then brought up a blank command prompt and got started. Naruto settled once more at his table, hot coffee in hand, and picked up his pencil. He looked over the draft and made a few changes, settled on the dimensions and began to list the items he would need for the base of his sketch to work. He really needed to observe how the light moved in that room to really make this design perfect. He leaned back into his chair and stared out the window, failing to see the lump on the ottoman stir awake. Hinata blinked. She was aware that she was not in her room and that there was a strange-smelling blanket over her to block out the light of the sun. The distinctive sound of a pencil scratching told her that she was indeed in Naruto's room and everything she thought was a nightmare had really happened. She had broken down miserably in front of him and cried. Her face felt rough, puffy and her hair was sticking to skin. How was she going to get out of here with her pride still intact and inflict a severe memory loss on Naruto to avoid this? Tayuya's day had started off miserably. The ex-Hyuga Corporation tech was greeted earlier that morning with her co-workers, Yukon and Sakan, bitching about how their weekly purge of the Rasengan landscaping server had been interrupted and how they couldn't re-establish the connection. If that hadn't been bad enough, their boss Kabuto had come down to personally light a fire under their asses to get it back up. Now she was facing a new problem that was really rubbing her the wrong way. Someone had tried to gain access to their servers a couple of hours afterwards, only to be shut down hard by the complex firewall she and her team had created. She tried to trace the would-be hacker, but it ended up being a wild goose chase when they discovered it was a telemarketing company out of Indonesia. She seriously doubted they would be trying to hack them. Her thoughts were interrupted when her large teammate stood up from his computer and started to walk out of the room. "Where are you going, fat ass?" she asked with an irritated sneer. The rotund man glared over his shoulder with his hand lingering lightly on the door. "Taiyuya, you know that women shouldn't use such language," he chastised lightly, knowing full well it wasn't going to change her opinion on the matter. "I'm just going to the restroom. I think you can handle things here for a few minutes." He opened the door to the darkened room and stepped out. The red-headed woman snorted derisively and turned back to her computer, thinking on a few good insults to bark back, but couldn't be bothered when the door clicked loudly behind her. "Fucking shit bag," she grumbled as she continued her attempts to connect to Rasengan landscaping server, but stopped short when a notification popped up and let her know of yet another intrusion. She quickly switched screens to check the hacker's progress and paled when she saw that they'd already bypassed the majority of the safeguards. "Fuck." Shikamaru smirked as his worm burrowed right through their firewall like it wasn't even there. After spending close to an hour putting the code together, he'd simply pointed the resultant worm in the direction of the enemy server and sat back to enjoy the show. While he could have spent all day breaking through the layers composing the firewall from hell, he instead opted to go the simple route. He'd been bypassing the damn thing all morning, so he had a very good idea about what the rest of the server's defenses were like. Based on his conclusions and various scenarios, he devised the perfect plan to take it down. As he watched, the worm was making its way to the last threshold standing between him and the data he wanted. Being a lazy genius had its perks sometimes. He idly noticed the other hacker's attempts to stop his code as he prepared a second hard drive to store all the data he could get his hands on once he had access. Turning back to his keyboard, he counted down the few remaining seconds in his head. 4, 3, 2. Kiba raised a brow in curiosity as Shikamaru's laptop seemed to come to life. "Damn it to hell. Why me? If I ever get my hands on this piece of trash." Taiyuya was sure that this day couldn't get any worse. In less than a minute, a worm had completely destroyed the once assumed unbreakable firewall and was busy tearing through their file systems, and there was nothing she could do about it. It shrugged off everything she'd thrown at it and kept going like it didn't even notice. Albeit it was only a few thousand lines of code, not a sentient being, but still. She just couldn't stop it short of physically disconnecting the main server line. Her eyes widened in understanding. "Jesus. That's it," she exclaimed as she jumped out of her chair and ran through the rows of server towers towards the far end of the room. Slamming against the back wall as she turned the sharp corner, she saw the metal box mounted on the wall where all of the main cables from the server farm ran to. Closing the distance in a flash, she was stopped cold as she realized that she had no idea which cable was the main. "Fuck it." Taiyuya grabbed the entire bundle of cables and, with a fierce yank, ripped all of the cables from the box. As the box belched out smoke and sparks, she gasped for breath, her brow furrowed in irritation. "Damn it to hell. Now I've got to explain this shit. Troublesome." Shikamaru had gotten a great deal of data during the short span of time that he'd had access to the system, but he'd have to sort through it all before he could come to any conclusions. He looked over his shoulder and eyed Kiba. He knew the man behind him would understand most of the jargon in his report, but he'd have to work with Kiba to make it simple enough for a certain idiot. Naruto raised a brow as he watched Hinata sit up quite stiffly. She didn't look at him as she smoothed out her hair and pulled it out of the dried drool on her cheek. It certainly wasn't very ladylike, but he wasn't going to say anything. "Good morning." He smiled at her. She continued to avoid looking at him and merely nodded in acknowledgement. That irked him a little bit, but he pushed it aside, knowing full well she would be embarrassed considering the situation. He was glad he'd managed to sneak out from under her. He could just imagine what that situation would have brought on. "Your coffee is still decently warm if you want it," he said as he pointed to the cup on his table and glanced her way. She was still staring at the floor. "I reheated it a little while ago." She still wouldn't look at him. If he hadn't been ridiculously exhausted, this wouldn't have bothered him. He was used to being ignored by other women, but there was something in her aristocrat behavior that was really rubbing him the wrong way just then. She was the one who came in his room in the first place and used him as a Kleenex. Never mind the fact that she had also requested him to play psychiatrist. She had no business making him feel like shit for her embarrassment. He sighed. "You know, I'll make sure to forget what happened, if you want," he said casually before turning back towards his drafts. His mood had darkened. He didn't expect that saying he'd ignored her development in humanity would annoy him so much, but he was irked. She fought every step she was making towards being her old self like a wildcat, refusing to acknowledge her own identity. She still ignored him. He fumed quietly. The silent treatment was not something he was fond of, nor did she know it was his catalyst in arguments with his friends. Hinata wanted to answer him, but she'd lost her voice. Her control over her frail emotions was iffy at best. She was feeling discombobulated and wondered if she was still dreaming. He debated ignoring her, just focusing on the drafts like he used to when Sakura pushed the same silent fight with him, but Kiba's words were still playing in his head. Just ask her. Could he really do that? He should really leave it alone. She was obviously very conflicted about whatever she remembered last night, but getting the cold shoulder from her after spending all that time comforting her was not settling well with him. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked her. She finally looked up from the floor and focused on his lips, avoiding his eyes. He dipped his head down at a weird angle, trying to catch her eyes, but he discovered she was like some sort of ninja. She completely avoided any contact. "Hinata." She still refused to look at him or answer him. He rolled his eyes and turned from her, irritated at her behavior. "If you're just going to ignore me, you can leave." Like he needed this shit right now, he had better things to do than worry about her heiress persona. She flinched at his tone of voice. He seemed angry. She didn't move from her staked claim on the ottoman and bit her lip, wondering if she could still walk out of here like nothing had happened. She gathered her courage and tried to stand up, but his voice cut her off from her efforts. "You know," he was watching her again and she felt the weight of his thoughts in the room. "Maybe you should tell me what's on your mind." She watched him carefully. His words hadn't quite sunk in. He was positive this wasn't going to work. "I noticed that you struggle with letting yourself be your old self." He glanced away when she narrowed her eyes. This was a touchy subject apparently. "I do not struggle," she nearly hissed out. He raised his brows in disbelief. "I'm pretty sure you struggle quite a bit, considering a few hours ago you were a crying mess." He pointed at her, thinking he was making a good point, but his jaw clenched when her eyes turned almost cold. "I would rather we did not discuss my current personal problems," she said with a tone that clearly told him to fuck the hell off. He saw this as a clear challenge to distinctively get her to speak about it, and that's exactly what he did. "I think you need to. You're acting awful bipolar." He felt a chill in the room. "Okay, that wasn't the right word," he noted as the temperature continued to drop. "I'm acting how?" She stiffened. Her body language was completely different from before and he mentally cringed. He just destroyed the efforts from the last 24 hours to bring her out of the Hyuga shell. The heiress was back in full force, fighting tooth and nail to keep the throne. He sighed. "What I mean is, keep your nose out of my business," she cut him off. That was the last straw for him. "What?" he said quite sternly, disbelieving of her reaction. She was startled by the way he had suddenly stood up and glared at her. She watched him tower over him and she suddenly felt very small. So she stood up as well, accepting his challenge. "Stay out of my business," she repeated, this time with a little more fire behind her words. Something snapped inside him. Who was it exactly that came into my room looking for a shoulder to cry on? He raised his voice above normal and she responded the same way. "You stole my chair," she offered in a detached tone. "Like that explains everything," he muttered out, stepping around her and began to drag the chair out of his room as he continued to glare at her. Even though they were having a disagreement, she couldn't help but admire the way his body moved back and forth as he dragged the ottoman a few feet. "I'll bring it back, Your Highness," he spat out. She flinched again, she hated that title. "Don't call me that," she retorted. Naruto paused and glanced at her, wondering if that was a hint of irritation in her voice, and snorted, wondering if Sakura had been right about her origin in robotics. "Don't call you what?" he taunted. She narrowed her eyes and her lips twitched. Well. What's this? A hint of irritability? I was starting to think all you could feel was nothing and misery." He flicked the fingers towards her as he named his very short list. Her lips thinned and her fists gathered at her sides. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded. Her voice cracking slightly, but he ignored it, hurt that she had completely disregarded him this morning and returned to whatever this persona was. He was getting pretty sick of the back and forth plays and he wanted to get to know the real girl under all those layers. Who knows? He tried to end the argument there, but he had unknowingly opened a floodgate in Hinata. He turned back to the ottoman and pulled at it once more, looked at the doorway and tried to remember how he got it in here in the first place. She wasn't done, far from it. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered harshly, her eyes stung with angry tears. He glanced over his shoulder and narrowed his eyes. "Hard to, you never stay the same long enough for me to figure it out. At least in elementary you were easy to read." He half mumbled the last part, but he should have really kept it to himself. He may as well have slapped her with his words. She felt another trickle of memory, fast flashes of him as a young boy far away from her, Sakura's voice listing off his favorite things, the various touches he'd bestowed on her as a child and how she had cherished each of them. Her heart swelled with the knowledge that she had loved him as a child and she was conflicted once more. Why was she remembering this now? Her girlish crush was back in full force, but she couldn't process the haze of want and anger. Tears had begun to fall against her will. Naruto watched her cry again and he cursed to himself, he'd gone too far. He was getting ready to give in and try to comfort her, but she raised her chin up in defiance. He saw a flash of the old Hinata before him, her chi raised before her father as she defended them at the last martial arts competition they had participated in. "I will not let you belittle me," she said brokenly. He faltered a little and sighed, leaning his forehead against the back of his hands which were still holding on to the ottoman. "I'm not Hinata." "Far from it," he mumbled. She sniffled and it tugged at his heart a little. "I'm not the girl you remember," she snapped. He could see the conflict on her face, her eyes were deeply confused as she battled her memories in a do-or-die fashion. He didn't know that she was fully aware now of why she loved him so long ago, and she was terrified of the fact that she had begun to crush on him again, this time as an adult and in an entirely different light. She was angry that Ero Hinata had won and she let out a strange strangled sound of frustration as she wiped at the offending tears. She hadn't cried in nearly 13 years and for the past week she'd nearly done it every day. She had to get away from him, from them. "I know you're not," he replied, squeezing his eyes shut and pushing back the memory of her as a child. She had loved him back then, but they were miles apart now. There was no way in hell she'd look at him the same way she used to. If only he had known, maybe he would have been able to get her out of her shell then, maybe he could have loved her back. "I know you don't want to remember us," he started, but she let out another frustrated growl, unaware that she was well aware of her past now and she didn't want it. This was his fault, all his fault. "Stay out of my life," she shouted angrily. He was taken by surprise by her outburst and it took a minute to register her demand. He snorted. "You can't get rid of me that easy, we have a contract." He flicked that in her face quite smugly and she stared at him in disbelief. His argument was quite childish, but instead of being able to respond in a mature manner, she gritted her teeth and stuck out her tongue. He laughed at her. Laughed. She was furious. Before she could really retort, she was hit with another wave of memories. His smile blinded her from the past. His filthy sticky fingers intertwined with her when he picked her off the ground while they practiced. Her cousin Niji's snarky comments only refuted by her Naruto. Droves of emotions poured out of nowhere overwhelming her, she couldn't stop it. The voices were loud, the laughter, the tears, the promises. She was spiraling, she was losing control, she shouted the rest of her thought without meaning to. Naruto recovered from his fit of laughter and raised a brow in confusion. There was something going on that he wasn't privy to and it became clear once her tears began running freely down her face. There was barely a few seconds between her rage and crying and he was more than just confused, her inner struggle was getting ridiculous and he'd had enough. Control. He was one to live by the seat of his pants, always looking for the challenge. He'd never settle for the safety of a schedule. Who needed that? Who says you have to be in control of everything? He started, causing her to open her eyes. Her hands attempted to cover her ears, but his voice was too loud. She could still hear him through the flesh. "Why do you think you need to control what you feel, or anything at all for that matter?" he shouted, getting tired of the argument. She was worse than Gaara at this point, at least he had a medical problem that made him crazy. She whimpered through the tears, knowing full well he was correct, but her father's voice was. He closed the space between them quickly and gripped her shoulder in an attempt to keep her from turning away. She wanted to disappear, wanted to be invisible again. Make them stop. The voices were jumbled together, screaming, laughing, crying. The chaos was overwhelming and his voice pierced it, grating on her nerves more than ever. Naruto was having trouble keeping her still, she was struggling hard against him and he could feel the clothes shifting as she slipped away, but she didn't know he had decided he was going to get through to her if it killed him. She let out a strange mewl as he tightened the grip and she couldn't quite figure out what it was exactly he wanted her to say, or do. "Emotions are," she started. Her mind's eye could see her father's own, angry, disappointed and she couldn't get away from it. He cut her off with a loud and crude snort of disbelief. His fingers tightened again, bringing her back from whatever corner of her mind that had taken her momentary sanity. She could feel them biting into her skin, but it didn't upset her. In fact, she was grateful since it had dispelled her father's frightening sneer. It still didn't excuse the fact that this argument was getting out of control and so, she resumed her struggle and Naruto continued to glare. She was feeling frantic, crazy and the voices. "Emotions are vital to life," he whispered harshly. His eyes narrowed and they darkened to a deep blue. "I don't know why you think that smiling is a bad thing, or that crying is a sign of weakness, but the Hinata I knew was never afraid to be herself, regardless of the disappointment she thought she may cause." His comparison broke through like a slap across her face. This Hinata, this adult Hinata was nothing compared to her old shameful self. She stopped fighting him and his grip loosened up. She noticed him visibly relax, but his eyes were still hard, still occupying her being. She couldn't look at his eyes, they were accusing her of something, she couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was something she knew she should be ashamed of. She stared at his mouth and although she could hear his boyish voice whispering to her. She was someone I was proud of. She would never let anyone tell her who to be, how to act, how to. He didn't quite know how to finish that, but he was sure he'd made his point. Reality and fantasy suddenly stopped merging and his voice fluttered through another barrier without restraint, and she was helpless to watch from the sidelines. Hinata blinked as the last words left his lips. Proud, she repeated dumbly. He was proud of me. Naruto let go of her shoulders and sighed, turning away. She'd been silent this entire time and he felt like he was talking to a blank canvas. He was at a loss on what to say next. At every turn he'd slam straight into a wall she'd created, refusing to let him in. To let him help her. Her heart swelled painfully as the memories slowed down, her head ached and the voices started again. Who are these people? She wanted out of her head. She was also realizing at the same time that she still wanted him, to acknowledge her, to love her. But, wasn't she broken goods now? Her mind was unstable, her honor questionable, no control, no control. She knew that no matter how much she tried to deny it now, it didn't change the fact that she wanted him, now more than ever. It was illogical and something her father would completely disapprove of since Naruto was volatile, unpredictable, outspoken and so bright. He was still mumbling, his added noise was maddening with all the other ones, so she decided he needed to shut up. She needed a few minutes of silence so she could process all the memories and emotions flooding her. Hinata, He didn't get the chance to finish as he felt her small trembling hands grab his shoulder. She brought his face level to hers and stared fiercely at him as much as her watery eyes would let her. She didn't even register his gaze that was filled with confusion. There was no logic to her thoughts. All she could think was, shut up, just shut up. She kissed him, hard and fully on the lips. His eyes widened to near painful levels and he briefly struggled against her fingers that were tightly wound up in his shirt collar. The kiss was anything but romantic. It was filled with anger, sadness, and regret. Naruto pushed her away harshly without meaning to. His eyes narrowed in anger at the unwanted invasion. Hinata lost her footing and crumbled to the ground, but he had been so shocked by her advance he didn't even try to catch her. Her own confused, hurt and angry gaze met his in a challenge he couldn't decide if he wanted to take. What the fuck, was all he could manage to say in disbelief. The last thing he had expected from her was a kiss. Wah. He mumbled, speechless at her unusual behavior and the rape of his face. She noted the charge of emotion fluttering across his beautiful features, his scars darkened under his flush of anger, maybe embarrassment. She didn't know what he was feeling, but anger was definitely one of them. That's right. She was struck with reality once her memories cleared. I am no longer the little girl infatuated with. Memories of her father drilling long, drawled-out speeches on how cumbersome emotions were and her lack of discipline. How he drilled the control of emotion to be perfect, to be without flaw. To not be Hinata, but to be. She frowned at the memory fluttering in of her father's hard eyes spitting angrily, his mouth gritting out every syllable slowly. You are nothing if you are not a Hyuga. Do not shame us, he yelled while she fought back tears of loneliness. That's right, she was Hyuga first and foremost. His blue eyes were icy and his mouth continued to gape like a fish in a silent demand for an explanation she didn't want to give. Couldn't give. She stood up haphazardly from where she'd fallen, smoothed her tousled hair and brushed her thighs smooth of wrinkles. She glanced at him once more and he noted a strange calmness about her. Her eyes void of that confusion that had plagued her since waking in his room that morning. I apologize, she said, detached of emotion. Naruto blinked at the sudden change in her. There was finality in the way she bowed her head down, cleared the tears from her cheeks, turned tail and walked away. She could see him as a little boy in the back of her mind. She silently said her goodbyes and pushed the emerging old persona as deeply as she could, wanting to forget everything again blissfully. Her emotional distress was too much to bear, she had to get away from him before she lost all hope of what? What is wrong with me, she thought fearfully, happy that the voices had finally stopped. She heard Naruto say her name with a strange desperation. Her lips still burned with the stolen kiss, but she'd never acknowledged that to herself, to anyone. She didn't look back when he called her again, resisting the command he knew made her obey, and walked out of his line of sight into her own room. The door clicked behind her as she stood in the darkness of her room. She pressed her back against the door and slid down, fresh tears spilled again and her heart ached. It ached so much she thought she was going to die. She was not worthy of anyone in this state, she was nothing to be proud of. She let the darkness of her heart envelop her in comfort, she heard Naruto swear and the front door of her home slam shut. She was not worthy of Uzumaki Naruto. He groaned while leaning his head against the steering wheel of his car and wrapping his fingers tightly around the rubber. His nails dug into his palms painfully, but he ignored it, his mind was in complete and total chaos over what had just happened. He eyed the house momentarily from the driveway and lightly tapped his forehead against the wheel in a strange pattern, increasing the weight of his head with each thump and swearing under his breath. This was not happening. Not even noon yet and I've crushed someone's livelihood. He leaned away from the wheel and reached into his pants pocket, or tried to, only to realize he had strutted out of the house in his boxers. Groaning again, he shut his eyes tightly, let go of the steering wheel, and rubbed his face with both of his hands in frustration. Just fantastic, he mumbled through his fingers in disbelief. He'd forgotten his keys on his graph table and after that marvelously dramatic exit, he wasn't about to swallow his pride and waltz back into Hinata's house to retrieve them. His hands combed through his hair as he leaned his head against the leather seat. He continued to stare at the door of her home and unconsciously extended his right hand towards his room, willing for the keys to propel themselves off the desk. And come to him. Come on. Get out. Here, he thought quite forcefully, but it certainly didn't take a genius to figure out they were staying on the desk and that he was an idiot. How was he supposed to run from his stupidity if he was idly parked in the driveway of his glaring problem? Maybe I can hot-wire the car. He shifted his weight and dipped his head below the steering column and eyed the plastic panel there. The mere thought of having to destroy anything in his car for the sake of keeping his pride made him falter and he apologized for even thinking of hurting his little baby. He collapsed his upper body against the lower seat, half sitting, half lying down, his side aching as the shift stick dug into his side. He couldn't remember who had the spare key to his car and asking somebody that would mean openly admitting that he'd majorly fucked up with Hinata and having to put up with their banter. He frowned, wondering why he was even worried about who would make fun of him for being trapped in his keyless car, outside in the cold, with only boxers and a shirt on. He had more important things to worry about, like how he was going to act normal after that kiss and how he was going to apologize for shoving Hinata onto the ground in a fit of surprise and crushing her now obvious affections. That had beyond shocked him. His mouth still burned with the forceful pressure of her petite and soft lips against his. Ironically, the feelings she'd put behind that kiss had barely registered with him. His brain had completely shut down when they made contact with his. They'd sparked something old in him and he was a bit confused. He did like her, but did he like her because she was intriguing or because she used to like him? Did he like this Hinata or did he like the idea that she loved him once upon a time and is flattered by that knowledge? This is confusing as hell. He stared at the radio of his car and wondered a moment if he still had the spare cell in the glove box. His free hand reached over, opened it and removed the backup device. He eyed the cell and wondered who he could bail him out. If he had indeed fallen for the Ice Princess, he had to make sure it was for the right reasons. She was fragile and adding more instability or uncertainty right now would only make things worse than they already were. Did he really like her? I don't know, he said out loud to no one. He sat up with a sigh. His left thumb pressed lightly across the keys of the cell phone, his mind wandering over the numbers he knew by heart. He knew Hinata challenged him, there was a tingle when he saw her, and he smiled more. Compared to when he fell in love with Sakura, this feeling was entirely different. Sakura's love was suffocating, bogged down with regrets and promises he didn't know he could fulfill. Hinata's love was, well, it represented something. It was more, it had more. Fuck. He couldn't figure it out. He quickly dialed Kiba's number. And grumbled, finally remembering that his spare set was in his office. At least he could get some extra clothes. He might as well go into the office and see what the damage was after that bullshit from this morning. His mind wandered to Hinata again, the feel of her kiss still lingering. Kiba's voice cut through his thoughts from the phone, and as Naruto explained the dire situation he was in, he asked himself a question that shook the foundation of his feelings. Was it really Hinata that liked him, or was it the old Hinata that was resurfacing? Either way, he'd drawn a definitive conclusion in the last 15 minutes, he was a fucking retard through and through, no question about it. Shikamaru leaned back into his chair and eyed Kiba as he dug out the cell phone from his pocket and walked into the hallway. That annoying polka was starting to get to him, but the fading laughter from Kiba was becoming equally irritating. Fucking retarded, you know that, was heard clearly by the genius, and he rolled his eyes, wondering what Naruto had gotten himself into this time. He brought his attention back to his laptop as his overworked fingers reached for a near-empty can of pop on his new workspace. He idly took the last sip before crushing it, considering it was only weak aluminum. Smirking at the sound, he dropped the crushed can on his other table and proudly admired the 8x8 patterns he'd managed to complete with his discarded cans. The irritating laughter drifted in again, and Shikamaru could only sigh as he forced his mind back on his little problem. While digging through the raw data in order to solve this puzzle, he'd found some things that angered and annoyed him greatly. Yakushi Technologies had screwed over Rasengan Landscaping from the second they signed that contract. Leaning forward, he brought up the spreadsheet he'd made and scrolled down as he shook his head. Naruto's babies had been compromised the instant he let those snakes touch them. The so-called security program that had been installed on the servers had created a permanent backdoor that couldn't be removed short of completely formatting the hard drives, something he knew the blonde idiot would never allow without being completely free of the other company. There's more than enough proof here to let Naruto break that stupid contract. The pineapple-haired man sighed deeply as he thought of his new boss. How could anyone be so computer illiterate in this day and age? Sure, not everyone knew the difference between a hard disk and a diode, but to not know anything past how to turn on the machine and use a few programs? This was completely unacceptable. He'd have to force the man into taking courses once he was officially contracted with them. Shikamaru quickly cut off that line of thought before he lost his focus completely. He was getting tired, and before he called it a night, he had to make this secure again somehow without breaking contracted rules. He picked up the document from his desk and thumbed through it quickly, his mind still wandering on the hacking timeline. It had started off as nothing more than updates to the security program that allowed them more access to the file system. It had eventually escalated to activating the built-in webcams in all the monitors on various update nights and the copying and stealing of random files. Connecting through proxies and taking specific files had only started happening a month or so ago. He paused a moment while reading a specific passage in the contract and groaned, wondering if Naruto had been lobotomized. How could anyone willingly sign a contract that allowed another company to have free reign over their property? It was like handing a complete stranger the keys to your Viper and telling them they could drive it whenever they wanted. Troublesome idiot, he repeated over and over inside his head as he continued to see his boss's shortcomings while digging through his copy of the contract to make sure he was within the guidelines. Putting down the lump of worn sheets, he wondered why anyone would want to steal landscaping plans. There had to be more to this than he could see right now, but the contract was getting in his way. He glanced down at his watch and winced when he realized how long he'd been sitting in front of his computer working on this project. Nearly noon, I need to eat. He listened for Kiba, but he was still on the phone. They still needed to put a comprehensive report together for Naruto. I can't go get you. Kiba tried to keep from smiling, but he couldn't help it while imagining Naruto freezing in his car begging for a ride. Why not? The blonde asked irritably. Because this is far too amusing. Kiba cracked up again. Naruto snorted in annoyance. "Fuck off, you asshole. Come get me," he nearly shouted this time. He really didn't want to go back inside the house and get his keys, he'd rather freeze to death. "Call Sakura. She's closer to the Hyugas than me. No, she's going to be asking me a ton of questions if I get her to pick me up." Kiba started to laugh again. "This is entirely your fault, you bastard," Naruto continued. "How is this my fault?" He sobered up quickly at the accusations, the smirk never leaving his lips. "You told me to ask her what was up," he pouted. Kiba shook his head. "Why on earth would you ever listen to me?" Naruto sighed, another point to Kiba. "Fine, I'll call Sakura. I'll be in the office later to come get some clothes." He flipped the phone off, cutting the irritating barks of laughter from his partner, and wished some unpleasant accidents to befall him while he dialed Sakura's number. The tanned man wearing a headband sat across the desk from his silver-haired boss with a bored expression. Kabuto narrowed his eyes as the technician continued to chew what he called homemade gum. To his disgust, it was a sticky and stringy substance that reminded him of spider webs. "How far? Will this set the plan back, Kidamaru?" He gave a slight shrug as he answered. "It shouldn't be too bad. Once the twins finish rewiring the server room, we should be back up and running." He blew one white bubble between his lips until it made a loud pop sound before continuing, irking Kabuto further. "Though I'm curious as to how we're going to carry out the full plan if we don't have ready access to Rasengan Landscaping's recent plans." His boss waved away the concern airily. "I've already sent Tayuya and Jirobo to see if they can re-establish the connection from that end." Kidamaru raised a brow, not entirely surprised that Kabuto had already taken measures to fix the problem. "I expect for them to have it up by the end of the day and we should be back in business as soon as those two finish repairing the damage Tayuya caused." Kidamaru gave a quick nod. "The real issue is this guy that's attacking our network. If he had been trying to do real harm instead of just trying to get data out, he could have really screwed us." Kabuto held his chin in thought for a moment before nodding sharply. "Once you get Rasengan Landscaping back on the network, get the full team together and track this guy down. I want him neutralized by the end of the week, understood?" Kidamaru gave an affirmative grunt as he stood, knowing he was being dismissed. He walked towards the door, but stopped halfway there and turned back to the silver-haired man in the business suit. "You wanna remind me why we're doing all this again? Seems kinda lame backing off this company to get to the real prize." Kabuto adjusted his glasses with a smirk before he answered. "Like the corsairs of France, we are merely the hired hands to the king who seeks his rightful place." He stated. Kidamaru gave him a questionable stare that only amused Kabuto. "We must destroy those who support the false king before we can move in for the kill." The tanned man snorted as he turned back towards the door. "Yar!" he muttered sarcastically under his breath as he closed the threshold behind him. A white van bearing a golden YK symbol pulled up in front of Rasengan Landscaping and parked in one of the reserved spots near the front of the lot. Two figures exited the vehicle, went around to the back and retrieved a toolbox and a bundle of cable before slamming the doors shut. They quickly made their way to the front door and crossed the lobby towards the security desk. The bored-looking guard put down his magazine and focused on the odd pair in front of him. "Can I help you gentlemen with something today?" he asked before he broke into a wheezing cough. "Yes, we're from Yakushi Technologies and we've got a work order to take a look at the servers," Jirobo stated as he handed the sickly-looking guard a clipboard. "Apparently, the security update never happened on your system and we've been unable to connect from our end to manually install it, so they sent us here to see what the problem was." The man looked down at the clipboard before checking his own digital list of scheduled visitors for the day. When he noticed Yakushi Technologies, marked with "Contact Kiba immediately" as one of them, he turned his attention back to the duo. "I'm sorry sir, but you're not scheduled," he lied expertly. He was a little suspicious of the duo, something seemed a little off. "I'll have to call upstairs to see what they want to do." Thinking nothing of the issue, the hefty technician smiled amiably and gave a nod. No problem. We'll wait while you get confirmation. He hefted the cable off of his shoulder and placed it on the ground. The woman lugging the toolbox turned away from the desk and grumbled irritably under her breath, causing the guard to give her a questioning glance that she failed to see. Jirobo noticed this and intervened before the man could ask. She's had a bad day, he explained as an apologetic smile graced his lips. A virus has been giving all of us trouble, which is why we're so concerned about getting this update installed. Hey-8 gave a nod and picked up the phone to call the boss. Yeah, that's good Shika. I'm pretty sure even a toddler could understand that, commented the dog owner with a grin. The tech gave a sigh of relief and sank back in the comfortable lopsided chair in Naruto's office. Good. I was beginning to worry that it would be impossible. Kiba snorted his agreement and reached down lazily to pet the huge dog lying next to his chair. It was coming up past lunchtime and he'd gotten zero sleep the night before because of all the craziness. Just as Kiba was contemplating making a suggestion for a nap break, the phone on his desk rang. Barely moving his head, he glanced at the readout and saw that it was the front desk. Grumbling, he sat up and removed it from the receiver. What's up, Hey-8? Mr. Inuzuka? Where's Mr. Uzumaki today? The voice on the end of the line said. Kiba sighed. I thought we told you to call us by our first names. Naruto's going to be gone for a time taking care of a major contract. The guard merely coughed in response as he eyed the two across the lobby. Normally I would refer to you as such, but we have visitors down at the front desk and I didn't think it would be wise, he replied in a quite hushed tone that seemed rather suspicious to Kiba. A couple of technicians from Yakushi Technologies wanting to see the server room and considering the warning left next to the company name. He stopped looking when one of the technicians looked towards him from where he was seated. I thought it would be best I called. You know anything about that? Kiba's fatigue disappeared as he sat up straight in the chair. Did they say why they wanted to see it? He asked seriously. Hey-8 caught the change in tone and eyed Jirobo and Taiyuya again. Something about a security update that failed to install. Kiba let out a low growl that had Akamaru looking up at his master. Security updates my ass. He motioned to Shikamaru to stay quiet and to pay attention. Listen up. Those technicians don't go past the lobby. Stall for time while I get some things ready up here. Shikamaru raised a brow in curiosity while Kiba pinched the bridge of his nose in irritation. Tell them I'll be down to meet them shortly. Oh, and call the two other guards from upstairs. Izumo and Kotetsu. I'm going to need them for a setup. Will do, boss. See you in a few, he said as he hung up and turned to Jirobo and Taiyuya. Mr. Inuzuka will see you personally as soon as he finishes up with some business. The two techs nodded and didn't ask why it wasn't Naruto meeting them. Sakura stared at Naruto while he hopped into her overly pink beetle. He hated this car, it was so goddamned girly. So, let me get this straight. He tried to glare at her, but he couldn't do it seriously in his boxers with his teeth clattering from the cold air. She grinned as she heard him groan, "You're too chicken shit to man up and get your keys after arguing with Hinata over." Ugh. He was going to have to tell her everything. He wasn't looking forward to that, not one bit. Come on, you need to tell me if you want me to get you some clothes. She smirked. He hated his life, so much. That gleam in her eye only meant trouble and he knew Ino was going to know everything by supper. He had to give in. Start driving. I'll tell you everything and you need to make sure you keep both hands on the wheel. He pointed at her hands while making his point. She put the beetle in reverse and started to laugh. You think I'm going to beat you? She noted a car that stopped at the end of the driveway to let her by. She didn't recognize the driver since they were wearing shades and the windows were quite dark. She eyed her ex as he sighed again, his head drooped in defeat. You might, he meekly responded. She raised a brow and shook her head, wondering just what the hell he did to be in this situation. Hanabi watched the pink car drive away with Naruto in the passenger seat. She narrowed her eyes and frowned, wondering why the blonde was shivering and so poorly dressed. She looked up towards her sister's house and sighed, contemplating if it was something that was fixable. Naruto looked absolutely miserable and worried. She pulled into the driveway, climbed out of her car and took in a deep breath. She had to break the news to her sister that their father was in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's and that she needed to sign some paperwork while he was still lucid. She made her way to the front door and debated in knocking, but decided she wanted to surprise her older sister. She pushed the door open and was a bit surprised to hear nothing but a soft sob in the darkness of the hallway. She quickly made her way through and stopped a moment, noticing half of Hinata's orange ottoman sticking out of the guest room. She wasn't one to question her sister's odd habits, so she ignored it and knocked on her sister's bedroom door. "If they sent texts, then they're probably the same ones that I had that skirmish with earlier," commented Shikamaru as he walked side by side with Kiba towards the security room. "If I can get a good look at their faces, I can figure out exactly who I'm dealing with." Kiba tossed a light windbreaker on without breaking his stride. "Good. The more we have on these guys, the better." He looked around for his mutt, but it wasn't following him. "I've got Kotetsu and Izumo downstairs getting your plan ready. I don't intend to let them anywhere near our system again," he growled. Coming to an abrupt halt, he turned to his genius friend with a frown. "You'll be okay operating the cameras, right?" Shikamaru scoffed with a smirk. "I think I can handle myself, Kiba. You just worry about getting those technicians out of here." Kiba gave a feral grin and whistled for his dog. "I've got it easy. For once, I'm actually glad for that damned contract." Akamaru appeared from Naruto's office while Kiba zipped up the jacket halfway. "You want fish for lunch? I'm running by the Japanese takeout place and grabbing some teriyaki and rice for myself." The lazy man shrugged and unlocked the security room with the key Kiba had given him and stepped inside. "Sounds good, just make sure it's not that smelly fish. Something about it rubs me the wrong way." Kiba made a disgusted sound and nodded his head. Before the door could close, the dog owner caught it with his foot and stuck his head inside. "Hey Shika. Thanks for all this on the down low, man." He grinned. "As soon as we deal with all this, Naruto will hire on your company for our IT support," he added in confirmation. Shikamaru smirked. Nara Corporate Solutions is all about working in the shadows. For some odd reason, Kiba couldn't help but laugh at the company motto. There was nothing confidence-inspiring about the situation as Sakura slowed down and pulled onto the highway shoulder, the way her fist gripped the steering wheel, the odd growl vibrating in her throat and the twitch in her brow. "No, Sakura." Naruto could feel the killing intent seeping out of her pores. Her face was hidden by her vibrant pink hair, but his fear was apparent, translucent even, as he would later describe to his grandchildren. "You," she said in a low threatening tone he had no intentions of ignoring. He quickly calculated how fast he could get to his home half-naked and bare-footed from here, but he was sure Sakura would find a way to run him down several times before getting there. Didn't TTT mean to," he stuttered out, his heartbeat was out of control. He could have sworn he heard the wheel snap under her fists. He'd done it now. "You fucking shoved her off," she yelled. Loudly. To the point his ears were ringing mercilessly. He crouched into himself, waiting for the onslaught of punches, but they never came. She continued to glare that evil stare that made his skin crawl in fear. "She kissed me out of the blue," he tried to defend, but she wouldn't hear any of it. She threw the car back in gear and peeled out of the parked spot, muttering things that she would do to him once she got home. He blanched and prayed to whatever god that was sympathetic to his cause. "I can't believe you," she ranted. "I should drive you right back there, march you in and throw you in front of her, begging for her forgiveness, you ass," she seethed. He cringed, knowing full well she wasn't joking. Please don't, I need time to. She shot him another glare that forced him to gulp. The car swerved and she swore under her breath again. Every one of you. All the fucking same. He felt completely defeated. You need to man up, Naruto. She's not something you should throw aside, she spat out. The sting of her words hit both of them. She herself had been used and thrown away, and in turn, she had used and thrown aside Naruto. The cycle continued. Not if she had any say in the matter. I'm not going to do that. I'm just not sure if she's. He struggled a moment on how to explain it without it coming out the wrong way. I just want to make sure it's her that wants this, and not her memories, he mumbled out, embarrassed a little at the admission. Sakura looked away from the road a moment in shock at the blonde's confession. You like her? She was a bit uncomfortable with the discussion considering that she still fiercely loved him, but they had agreed a long time ago that they were not a good fit. No matter how much they wanted to be together. Yeah, I think I do. He shivered, reached over and turned up the heat. But I fucked up major. He leaned his head against the window pane and stared at the glove compartment. His thoughts wandered back to Hinata's crying face and the void of emotion in her eyes as the fight ended. How was he going to drag her out of that wall again? He'd managed to get really close this one time, but completely screwed up. Sakura heard him sigh, his finger drew an endless circle on the pane. He was so pathetic. You're pathetic. He shot her a dirty look without lifting his head from the pane. She rolled her eyes and shook her head. If she's figuring out her feelings, there's no way you could have screwed up that bad, she chastised softly. Her heart was going out to him, this was where they split apart, and she was going to be a memory for him. I don't know, something about the way she ended the argument, he reminisced. She bowed to me. Sakura raised a brow and pressed her lips together. Her voice had no emotions, her eyes were completely. He couldn't even finish his sentence. There was an ache in his chest when he thought about her eyes. He needed to get her back, needed to have her laughing again. Don't worry, we'll figure something out, Naruto. They drove in silence until they reached Sakura's apartment. Hanabi stared at the lump her sister represented. She wasn't impressed. Get dressed. Father is requesting your presence. She kicked her sister's foot and Hinata only ignored her. She was positive she saw the older girl blink, so there was no way she was dead. Her skin looked abused, it was red and puffy, her hair was a complete mess and she was still dressed in her pajamas. What happened? I saw Naruto leave with Sakura. This question seemed to have stirred life back into the heiress. Sakura, she asked meekly, her voice raw from all her crying. Hanabi raised a brow, wondering what had her sister in such a mess. Yes, she picked him up. In his boxers, mind you. She narrowed her eyes as Hinata sat up from her position on the floor. She had laid down after sliding down the door. Her sister had forcibly pushed her away when she entered her room. Hinata brought her hands to her face and rubbed in frustration. Of course he'd call her, she's the love of his life, she thought jealously before being able to shake the feeling away. She had no business being jealous, she was not worthy of him, of his sunshine or his nectar. She sighed and Hanabi shook her head. What happened? She asked again, slightly amused that her sister seemed to have completely lost control on the situation. She'd have to thank Niji later for this devilish plan. Hinata eyed her younger sister and repressed the urge to hit a few disabling pressure points she could reach. That smirk meant something was going as planned. She hated her siblings. Why does father need to see me? She casually asked, uninterested. Since her father had been diagnosed with early Alzheimer's, he'd kept himself in isolation, only seeing Niji to sign documentation. He's not doing very well, the younger Hyuga replied while she watched her sister strip off the pajama and pick more suitable clothing for the meeting. Not quite formal, not quite casual. She had great taste in clothes. How so? He's having a lot of emotional lapses and it's worrisome. Emotional lapses. Hinata almost laughed. Her father was the biggest emotional retard she had ever the displeasure of being exposed to since her accident. Although she sympathized with him a little, she was also suffering from emotional lapses. Yes, he's affected more so in that aspect than in memory. She looked away from her sister and looked around her room. It was quaint, cozy, and somehow it was ridiculously messy. It sort of reminds me of that Bendy eye syndrome. The what? Her elder sister asked, genuinely confused. Never mind. Hanabi shook her head. She'd forgotten her sister had lived under a rock and never watched Star Trek. Hinata shrugged and pulled the sweater over her head, walked over to her desk and picked up her brush. She looked at her face in the mirror and sighed. She was puffy and unattractive. That still doesn't answer my original question. She eyed her sister from the reflection of the mirror. Hanabi almost looked sad. He's been asking for you. She looked away from Hinata and considered making the bed. He's been thinking a lot about our mother. Hinata froze a moment in mid-stroke, her gaze questioning her sister for more information. Hanabi walked over to the bed and shook the blankets free from their tangles, smoothing out the wrinkles as she laid out the sheets. He's been lost in the past, asking where you are, where our mother is, and he won't stop apologizing. Her voice wavered a little by the end. It was sad to see her father's strong independent mind get eaten by such a cruel disease. Apologizing? Her sister asked again, her voice was laced with worry. Hanabi only nodded as she laid down the heavier blankets, the goose-feather duvet fluffed to a more respectable state. Yes, I would rather not tell you more, sister. She turned towards Hinata, who was wrapping her long tresses in a constricting bun. She hated that bun, but her sister wouldn't change the habit. Okay, I will meet with him and see what the problem is. Hanabi gave her a small smile that confused Hinata. I think you'll be saddened by what he has to say, sister, was the last thought the youngest Hyuga had before she followed Hinata out of the front door. Okay, one last check, you both know the plan, right? Kiba asked Kotetsu and Izumo. The shorter of the two men sighed and fidgeted slightly in the unfamiliar clothing he was wearing. Kotetsu still wore the bandage over the bridge of his nose like usual, but he'd changed out of his security uniform and into one of Naruto's spare sets of clothes along with his partner's bandana at Kiba's behest. Yeah, sure thing boss. Got it right and tight, he said evenly. What I don't know is why I got picked to be the one in handcuffs, he grumbled as he held up his bound wrists in front of him. Kiba blinked at the man in amazement while Izumo stifled a chuckle from behind Kotetsu. Crossing his arms across his chest, he grinned slightly and spoke as if to a child. Why Kotetsu, isn't it obvious? It's because you fit the bill. After all, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, he let the axiom drift off while the bound man's partner in crime finally let out a guffaw. Kotetsu sighed with resignation and frustration. Are you comparing me to a duck, Kiba? His superior slapped him heartily on the shoulder while keeping his grin in place. Of course not, Kotetsu. Why are you even complaining anyway? You're getting paid for this on top of a free lunch, the dog owner commented while Akamaru woofed in agreement, causing the usually carefree man to groan in defeat. The guard-turned-actor looked back at his friend and rolled his eyes. Let's just get this over with. Oh, and if you tell Naruto what I did, you're going to fucking regret it, he threatened. Izumo just laughed and started to push him towards the door leading to the lobby. Yeah. Save all those menacing glares for our guests, eh? What the hell is taking this guy so damn long? Tayuya grumbled to the large man sitting next to her. Jirobo shook his head, but didn't bother to chastise her on her language. Who knows, he said with a hint of exasperation. He was getting a little irked with her behavior. A few more seconds passed before the redhead got to her feet and began pacing the lobby impatiently. Hayate watched the foul-mouthed woman with veiled amusement as he waited for Kiba to finally come down from whatever it was that he was doing. He hoped it was soon. he didn't think the fiery redhead would be able to hold her temper in check much longer. As if answering his prayers, the side door leading to the lobby opened to reveal Kiba and his huge white dog Akamaru. Tayuya spun on her heel and faced the acting president with annoyance. "About fucking time," the guard heard her mumble under her breath. Jirobo got to his feet and began walking towards Kiba with a professional smile on his face. "Mr. Inuzuka, I presume?" he asked. A very annoyed-looking Kiba gave a curt nod and offered his hand to the technician. "That's correct. I apologize for making you wait for so long." Kiba glanced down at the name tag on the uniform the man wore. "Jirobo, but I had to finish dealing with a vandal. I'm really not surprised to see you guys here right now considering what happened." "How'd you find out about the damage so quickly?" he asked, managing to keep a professional expression on his face despite his apathy for the people standing in front of him. Hey-8 gave his boss a strange look behind their guests' backs since he knew that Kiba had caused that damage himself. Jirobo looked confused, but it was Tayuya that spoke first. "What the hell are you talking about?" Kiba gave her a genuinely surprised look before glancing back towards her coworker. "You didn't know? Well, I guess I'll fill you in," he said as the side door opened once more, causing Kiba to turn back. "Ah. Here's the culprit now." From the doorway stumbled Kotetsu as he was pushed by Izumo, followed closely by Shikamaru holding a pair of tapes and wearing Kotetsu's uniform with his normal bored expression. "Hey you ass. Quit pushing," exclaimed the bound man with a scowl. Izumo looked unimpressed as he grabbed the other man by the arm and led him towards the front doors. "Shut it. Being pushed around is the least of your worries where you're going. I don't know where in the prison bitch hierarchy vandals are, but I'm pretty sure it's not the top," he said with a laugh as he pushed open the double doors and took him outside. Tayuya and Jirobo turned back to Kiba with renewed curiosity. "What happened?" asked the stout man. Kiba ignored the question and turned to Shikamaru, who'd walked up next to his friend instead of following the others out, and took one of the tapes he was holding. "This the one we were gonna take to YT after we took him to the station?" he asked. Shikamaru only nodded in response before turning towards the elevator, not sparing the two technicians a second glance. He'd already memorized their faces. Kiba held the tape out to Jirobo and began explaining. "Early this morning, that man you just saw, broke into our server room and took an axe to the main server line." The larger man raised a brow and tried not to laugh. His partner narrowed her eyes, knowing full well he was laughing at her. Kiba missed the quiet communication as he swept his hand towards the man being handled roughly into his car. "This tape is a copy of the security camera feed from that room that we were going to bring to you so that you could have it for your records since the servers fall under your aegis." Jirobo took the tape and examined it momentarily before focusing on the other man again. Kiba grimaced and continued. "Unfortunately, I can't allow you to enter the room until the police can do a full investigation, so I'm sorry to say that your trip out here was in vain." Jirobo gave a nod and a smile. "I understand completely. I'll be sure to pass this along to my boss along with the situation." He offered his hand for another handshake, which Kiba gave quickly. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Inuzuka. Just give us a call whenever the police clear the room and we'll have your servers back up in no time." Giving a short farewell to the other man, he shot Tayuya a look that clearly told her to keep her comments to herself and leave quickly. Hey-8 blinked as the crowd of people left his lobby empty. He was confused to say the least and he'd been left completely out of the loop. "Just another day, at Rasengan Landscape," he mumbled before sitting down and picking up his paper again. Naruto flicked absent-mindedly through the radio stations, desperately wishing for the mix CD forgotten in his car. His gaze wandered from the dashboard to the bridge railing as his thoughts filtered out the unwelcome silence. In a single week, Hinata had thrown his life into complete chaos. Scratch that. She'd managed to completely make him question his sanity. He sighed and leaned back against the seat as Sakura turned off the ramp, giving up on his search for a good tune. He couldn't decide if it was the combination of his turbulent feelings with his indecisiveness, or the general good-for-nothing sense of dread that was filling his stomach with a solid lump of lead. He closed his eyes, listening to the radio host he'd picked to break the accusing silence blabber on about God knows what. Blowing the air out of his cheeks in defeat, he felt irritated at the small pang of guilt eating at his conscience. Would she even let me back into the house, he wondered. Then, it suddenly occurred to him. There was a small important detail he had entirely missed, a loophole in his mistake. He'd left the guest room in complete chaos. It helped to note that the ottoman was halfway out of the guest room door entirely in the way. He could personally attest that it was definitely too heavy for her to drag back to the living room alone. Good, he thought, I won't need an excuse with things this miserable. He felt rejuvenated, even if things were looking excessively bleak for him. Sakura suppressed the urge to reach over and pat him in comfort. He was completely miserable and her speech on how retarded he was didn't help the situation. He straightened up a little and she saw the usual twinkle return to his eyes. She imagined he was talking himself back into his usual unrelenting fighting spirit. What a relief. At least he had found the light at the end of this dreadful tunnel. After all the progress Naruto had made with pulling her out of her shell, it was a terrible setback to shove her away like that. She could understand why it had happened, surprising him in such a way mid-argument, but, still, it was a blow to the careful balance between her personas. They both sighed at the same time. Naruto glanced at her and she smiled despite the bad mood hanging between them. She turned right onto a smaller alleyway. The pink beetle made its way up her driveway, slowed and pulled into her reserved parking spot. She flicked her wrist to shut down the car and paused. The keys jingled momentarily as she folded her hands neatly on her lap. She ignored the press of the metal in her palm as she gave him an attentive glance. Naruto looked her way with a certain sadness she hadn't seen in quite some time. He was really heartbroken over this. She felt an odd pang as her own heart squeezed in sympathy. She gave him a reassuring smile that he didn't have the courage to reciprocate. His pride was bruised, his confidence had faltered and darkness had lodged itself inside him, keeping him from being able to overcome this. He grumbled loudly, startling her out of her thoughts a moment as she was in the process of escaping the cab of her car. She tried to catch his attention but he was too busy staring at the space between him and the building. He cringed and his toes wiggled in concern with the thought of the cold unforgiving asphalt meeting his tender naked flesh. He was positive it was mocking him, quietly laughing at his predicament. I could lend you my shoes. She grinned, pointing to the back seat. He did a mental hooray as he twisted himself around and reached for her gym bag. It didn't occur to him for a second that he should have known better than to trust his former lover in helping him out. You can choose between baby pink or dark red, she chimed. He groaned as he pulled out a pair of high heels. He dug around the bag, but he knew it was futile. There would be no slippers or sneakers there. I hate you, she heard him say before she slammed her door shut. She shrugged and giggled as he seriously considered putting them on. He threw them back in the bag, knowing full well he'd never live it down. He wasn't willing to put up with Sakura's taunting and humiliation just to save his toes. He squinted his eyes, mumbled something miserable to befall his stupidity and quickly hopped out of the car, beelining for the entrance. The coldness of the ground bit at the thickened flesh mercilessly. He counted the steps to salvation, but when he reached the glass doorway, he was met with a solid thunk of the lock meeting frame. He clenched his teeth and ignored Sakura's mocking giggle as she took her sweet time to get to him. Hurry the hell up, he shouted, hopping from one foot to the other. She shook her head and ignored his obvious irritated tone. She decided right then she needed to fix her slipping sock, readjust her pants, dig out her keys, and check her texts for good measure. She grinned when he made some choking angered sound, his arms waving agitatedly. She glanced at him casually and checked her nails, noting the slight chipping of her index paint, before resuming her slow steps towards the man who deserved every bit of torture she was handing to him on behalf of Hinata. Thank me later, Missy, she thought, smirking to herself. What's taking so long? For Pete's sake, I'm freezing my ass off. He could have sworn he saw his breath in the mid-afternoon crisp air, but chose to ignore his hallucination and instead focused his irritation towards his turtle of a friend. It's not my problem you strolled out of there in your boxers, a nasty shirt and nothing else. She tried to not giggle, but the amused tone slipped out, making him narrow his eyes. He was on to her and her devilish tricks to make him suffer. His hand hit his chest before he glanced down and groaned, his blue eyes rolled up into his head and he sighed dejectedly. He hadn't changed shirts yet and Hinata's mess was still caked and flaking in masses off his chest. Fan-fucking-tastic. Are you going to tell me what exactly happened between you and Uzumaki? Hanabi broke the awkward silence between the two as they waited for the elevator. Hinata resisted the urge to sigh, but her stiff reaction hadn't gone unnoticed. Her younger sister smirked silently. It seemed that Hinata had finally lost some of her control and was rather annoyed with her current situation. I do not think this is the appropriate time to be speaking about my personal problems, Hinata replied with what she thought was a controlled response, but it had come out all wrong. Hanabi blinked as she processed the highly annoyed, irritable pleas, could you kindly fuck off tone her sister had flicked her way. Hanabi burst out laughing, making her sister glare and cross her arms in irritation. She made a small hunk sound before the elevator doors opened up and invited the siblings up to see their ailing father. Hinata stepped inside and pressed the correct floor and quickly mashed the button that would force the doors closed before her younger sister recovered from her fit. It didn't work. Hanabi had her hand out between the open doors to prevent them from closing. Hinata narrowed her eyes and pressed her lips together. She was getting tired of people laughing at her expense. She wasn't sure what the joke was. But she was sick of being at the end of it. Stop laughing and get inside, she demanded, which only made her sister laugh harder and lean against the doorway, clutching her stomach. Hinata was slightly confused and was tempted to shove her sister out of the way so the damned elevator could go up and she could get this conversation over with. She came to the obvious conclusion that it wasn't going to be as easy as she thought, considering how proficient her sister was in the arts of trickery. What's so funny? She asked, pinching the bridge of her nose in exasperation. The laughter was becoming infectious. She was trying really hard not to smile, but her sister was now at the point where she was barely making a sound, gasping for air and sliding down the metal door. This was ridiculous. What is so funny? She asked again and, this time, her smile betrayed her and she slipped out a giggle. Soon she joined her sister into the fit of laughter, still not quite sure of the reason. Naruto cringed as he peeled off his shirt, he sighed and wondered absently what she was up to. In the dim lights of Sakura's bedroom, he glimpsed at himself in the full closet mirror doors and, without quite realizing it, recalled Hinata's sleeping form against his chest. He could see the outline of her face, the feel of her warmth against his skin, how her fingers had slipped into the crease of his arm while she embraced him. He subconsciously squeezed down against the ghostly memory. He couldn't prevent the racing goosebumps across his arms when he remembered how her breath had fluttered against his skin. He flushed a little and his lips tingled at the memory of the unexpected, and awkward, kiss. He sighed, groaned even, as he remembered the very feminine sounds that slipped out of her lips while she slept against him. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his head between his hands as he tried to ignore the lingering warmth from her, tried to forget the obstinate memory caused by the feel of her breasts pressed against him, but, it was too late. His thoughts had wandered off down a path he hadn't been on in a very long time. He thought about her blush, how it dusted her cheeks and the slight stutter that would come out when she was nervous, especially around him. It was endearing and he imagined that it would be an entire different scenario under the right circumstances. There was no denying it, he enjoyed indulging himself shamelessly in those little scenarios. He smirked. He especially liked the one where her blush had turned into a flush that crawled slowly down her neck and that stutter turned into something more primal, a sound that was much more needy and completely out of control. He couldn't help it, when he thought about her eyes in those situations, how he would crack her perfection, he felt a certain part of his body twitch in anticipation. He wanted her to let go, indulge herself in the feel of spontaneity and relish in the feel of sin. This was a fairly new development for this relationship, if he could call it that. He had to admit that knowing beforehand that she used to crush on him has given him an unfair advantage, but it also sort of prepared him for this, maybe even instigated his own interest in the heiress. She was haunting him, rooting her essence inside his mind, and he was beginning to accept her invasion. In fact, he was enjoying it too much, it seemed, as he felt a certain twitch inside his boxers. He groaned again. He hadn't thought about another woman like that in years, and he was positive it was because of this room. The mirrors were feeding the fantasies, and he needed to get out of here or he'd start picturing what Hinata's creamy thighs looked like spread around his waist, the feel of her around him, clutching his shoulders, and how their bodies looked like fucking the hell out of each other. Maybe he should get the same mirrors on the closet at his house. Blech. He looked away from the fantasy-inducing object and stood up, pushing away the smutty thoughts unwillingly as he tried to calm himself down. Funny how that sneak attack kiss had completely forced him to look at Hinata in a new light. A few days ago he couldn't stop thinking about how to break her shell, now all he wanted to do was split her open in the most primal way and hear her voice call his name at the top of her lungs. He was entirely hopeless and was discovering, unfortunately, that he was the kind of pervert his godfather would have been proud of. How did he go from genuine curiosity to closet pervert in the span of a week? He had to agree with his inner pervert that his temptations for the woman's body were moving too fast, even for him. He felt like a 16-year-old lusting after the forbidden fruit. It was highly unusual for him to be this infatuated, after such a short amount of time. Maybe he'd repressed old feelings for her from when they were children. He did spend quite a bit of time with her, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to have liked her then. He had just been too young and stupid to connect the feelings of admiration to liking her. Probably why Jiraiya always tortured him and called her his girl. Naruto paused a moment, his fingers flicking through the yellow hair to fix the stubborn spikes as he thought about his godfather and all the times he'd mentioned something about Hinata. Maybe I was a lot more transparent than I thought. One thing was for sure, he was driving the bus to hell and there was no coming back, since he'd busted the GPS, killed the driver and the map was soaked in blood. He gave himself a hard look, a solid talking to, in his mind, and reprimanded himself with another glare for not being able to figure out how to apologize sincerely and get her to open up to him again. But how? Maybe he shouldn't have run off like that and comforted her instead. Then again, what comfort's crazy? Question of the year, he mumbled as he pulled a clean shirt over his head he had found in Sakura's closet a little earlier. He opened up the wicker basket and threw the shirt in with Sakura's dirty laundry. He peeked in out of habit and rolled his eyes. Pink everything as always, old habits die hard. He made his way out of her bedroom and silently stalked the hallway towards the living room. He could hear the sounds of Wheel of Fortune belting out of the television and he had to smile a little. It was Sakura's favorite show. "You want to remind me why you keep my clothes in your room?" he asked. She glanced his way and refused to answer him, busy munching the reheated leftover rice from last night's dinner. He plopped down next to her on the couch and let his head roll against the back of the seat, landing on her shoulder. She shrugged him off, irritated at his unwanted invasion. Well? He was watching her, she could tell he was making fun of her. "If you'd stop throwing your shit in my laundry hamper every fucking time you slept in the guest room," she started, bits of rice flying out of her mouth when she made the F, in her words, "I wouldn't wash them and throw them in my closet out of pure laziness," she huffed. He was trying really hard not to laugh, but he was failing miserably. "Now, shut up. I'm watching my show." He smirked, amused at irritating her for once while she was concentrating on something. He started to reach for his phone that would usually be sitting in his shirt pocket, but he was struck with two things. This was an old t-shirt with no pockets and his phone was currently keeping his keys company on his draft table, at Hinata's. What about the spare, one would ask. Oh, that one's on the passenger seat of his car, sitting in Hinata's driveway. Great. I need to use your phone. Sakura quirked a brow at him and rolled her eyes before taking her phone out of her pants pocket and threw it at him before going back to her Wheel of Fortune. Hayashi watched as his daughters entered the loft he'd closed himself into over the last few weeks. His disease had quickly deteriorated his mind. He found it a little ironic that he was afflicted with something that stole his memories while he had worked so diligently to prevent Hinata from remembering her own past. He had much to speak of with his daughter. Niji had convinced him to tell the truth, tell her why he'd refused to let her remember her old self. Maybe this would even allow her to grieve for a mother she'd forgotten. Before he'd forget why he had in the first place. Hinata made her way through the small loft, the light that filtered and gave the place a sense of warmth that she knew did not exist. Even the sun lies for you, she thought as she noticed her father sitting in the living room. It was eerily quiet despite the comforting mumble of the radio host. She hadn't seen him in several weeks, she hated to admit it, but in all honesty, she had practically been avoiding him. He wasn't a pleasant man, almost cruel at times, and her past was filled with memories of his stern teachings. His disappointment in her was something he often became very vocal about if she could rely on the trickles of memory that seeped in every once in a while. She had questions in regards to when she woke in the hospital, such as why he had decided to recreate her into something cold, uncaring and forcing her to forget her mother, her friends, her past. Her love. Hanabi turned towards the kitchen, disappearing through the doors. Hinata heard running water and the sharp sound of metal against metal. Her sister was making their father's tea while making herself scarce. She knew the conversation was going to be unpleasant and she needed to get things ready for the onslaught of tears, shouting and, most likely, her father getting his ass kicked by his eldest. Hinata noticed papers strewn around the living room. It was messy, so she assumed that Niji had just left for a while. She approached her father quietly, but loud enough to announce her presence. She wasn't sure if he was awake or asleep. His face was impassive, eyes closed in a meditation. "Father," she quietly called to him, making him stir. His eyes focused on her momentarily and he gave her a soft smile. She blinked. Her father was smiling at her. She frowned. "You called for me?" she asked, taking a seat close to him. He nodded and waited as Hanabi approached with 3 empty cups, placed them on the coffee table, and sat down. She poured small amounts in the cups and passed one to her father before leaning in and kissing his cheek in greeting. Hinata frowned again. This was highly unusual. "Yes, Hinata. There are things we need to discuss." He looked down at the brown liquid swirling slightly inside the cup. "Such as?" She nodded to her sister, who had given her a cup as well. Hanabi winked at her, which startled Hinata even more. She was getting a little suspicious of them. "Your mother, my actions, and your lack of memory and what will happen once I die." He took a sip of tea and glanced her way. She remained impassive, but, inside, she was suddenly terrified of what he had to say as she felt the breath of her mother's ghost blow on the back of her neck. Needless to say, she felt the hair rise on her neck and she didn't want to turn around. "Drop me off back at Hinata's," Naruto demanded as he followed his ex through the kitchen. Sakura raised a brow and glanced at him over her shoulder. "Done feeling sorry for yourself," she chirped while putting her rice bowl back into the sink. She leaned back against the counter, crossed her arms and waited for him to answer. He narrowed his eyes, annoyed with her precise predictions. "Yeah, I have a few things to clean up." "At the house or personally?" She smirked. He pressed his lips together, annoyed that she had his little plan figured out. At least she didn't have everything figured out. "You gonna do something lame like get her flowers?" she joked, making him sigh. Okay, she had the whole damn thing figured out. "It's not lame when it has meaning," he retorted, almost depressed, especially in the language of flowers, anyway. She rolled her eyes. She didn't know much about the language of it, but saying sorry with flowers was overdone and somewhat cliché. Back then, when he did give her flowers in apology, he always gave her the weirdest combinations. She didn't get the meaning behind them then and she never will. Flowers were Naruto's thing. Fine, let's go then, you hopeless romantic. She grinned at him as he shook his head. She was totally onto him. Naruto stepped inside the flower shop, his keys back safely in his pocket snuggling his phone. He popped a lemon skittle and chewed it slowly. There were at least a dozen messages from Kiba, one from Konohamaru and a mocking one from Sakura he had deleted without even listening to it. She was grating on his nerves lately, more so than usual. The shit he would normally put up with was becoming an encumbrance. Maybe it was because he had his eyes on a different prize now, his heart had moved away from the safety net of Sakura and into the turbulent love of Hinata. It seemed she had noticed as well. She had cut out all those comments on how long it's been since they had fucked, stopped bringing up their breakup and how it could have been, how things were and how awful it was. She was quite silent on the subject of him moving on, but she still seemed the same as before, if not a little bit more cautious of what she said around him. He appreciated it, immensely, even if he knew she was a little opposed to it. Sakura took him for granted far too often and he knew she was realizing that he would no longer be hers alone much longer. He grinned at the thought of belonging to Hinata. It was an attractive offer that he would never have considered before this turbulent week. He had not been interested in relationships, being more focused on his career, but, like anything in life, when things are going smooth, there's always a bump in the road to make things interesting. She was the most interesting bump he'd ever encountered. He glanced over the brightly colored flowers, the deep hues almost seemed to kiss the lighter ones in a lover's caress. Which ones will bring the message clearly, he thought, his fingers touching the petals flesh of a purple hyacinth. He knitted his brow, this would not do. Although they meant to forgive, this was one of the flowers she had asked to put in her garden. It would be in bad taste to give her flowers she connected with her own sorrow. He needed something a little unusual, since they were both a little strange and out of the ordinary. Their relationship sure reflected that so far. He made his way towards the tulips, since they weren't usually something you would give a lover. It was an iffy message. Tulips in general flirted with the idea of a perfect lover and they were far from that point, but he was looking for something specific. A variegated tulip, one with purple hues. The meaning behind the type of flowers was quite forward but he wasn't one to tiptoe around a subject for too long. Besides opening his mouth, and possibly suffering a sudden attack of foot-and-mouth syndrome, this was the only direct way he could think of saying, "You have beautiful eyes." He had a strange fascination with them, what better way to say it? Now he needed another one to let her know he was interested, but, besides the rose, there weren't many options to proclaim his desire for her. Roses were cliché and he didn't want to get them. He always found them shallow and commercialized. He'd like to think he had a little bit more depth than that. Which one would show that I feel the same way, he thought, looking around and racking his brain on what he could use, which was when he saw it, in the corner of the shop, hiding behind the egotistical bouquets of roses, the jonquil. Perfect. Not only was this a very beautiful flower, it also meant desire. He hoped that, just like the flower's meaning, she would return his affections, or it would at least eventually be brave enough to openly convey her feelings for him, being that she was the one receiving the flowers from him. Hopefully this worked. I've taken something precious away from you, Hinata, something I had no right to decide on my own. I should have listened to the doctor. Her father's voice still resonated, echoes of the past haunted him as much as they haunted her. I wanted to erase everything, from that day. His voice didn't break, but his eyes gave his feelings away. She could see the pain there, the recognition of where his lack of reasoning had come from. I needed to erase her kindness from you because I could not bear to see it. Her laughter, her smile, the way she touched everything was the same way you touched everything, even when you had no memory of anything. You were the embodiment of her memory, her legacy, and I could not bear the pain of seeing my dead wife in you. I'm sorry, so sorry, Hinata. Her father had broken down. She hadn't said a single word to him the whole time she was there listening to him speak. Hours ticked by as he went on to divulge his deepest secrets, his darkest plans and his deepest pain. She'd always thought her father to be an emotionless man, but, in the end, it turned out he was a man so overwhelmed by emotion, he had to cut them away. She sighed, her mind still processing the conversation. He didn't know that she could remember most of her past now, all the things he'd said then. They both needed to grieve the loss of her mother. Hanabi had been too young and her father had been too shocked to allow himself to grieve. She had not been allowed to even feel the loss of her mother. "We're here," her sister's voice drifted through the thickness of her thoughts. Hinata felt out of it, unfocused. Her fingers fumbled the door handle and she waved goodbye to her sister as she pulled away into the twilight. She pulled her jacket closer, fighting the chill of the night. She had no tears left, she feared. She eyed the entrance of her home, noting the few lights that were on, and wondered if Naruto had returned. A knot formed in the pit of her stomach as she thought about earlier, the argument over nothing, the scuffle, the sneak attack kiss, and her running away. There was no way around it. She had run away from him and ignored him like a child when he had called her name. The fear of his rejection had taken over and it still had control over her. She made her way up the walkway. Her shaking fingers touched the metal of the knob, but they did not turn it. She was frozen there. Doubts were eating at her, fears of his reaction when he saw her and what he would say to her. What would she say to him? She was still in shock at her own actions with him. She also felt slighted with him that he called Sakura to pick him up, even if she continued to remind herself she had no business being jealous. She had no right to him, she had earned nothing to gain his favor. She gripped the knob and pushed the door open, peeking in, her eyes following the darkening hallway and with her ears perked to any unusual sounds, but it was quiet. Maybe he's gone to bed. She hoped to avoid another confrontation. She was tapped out on feelings and logic. She removed her coat, hung it on the coat rack and removed her shoes. She tiptoed to her room, but stopped in her tracks midway. The orange ottoman was in front of her door and, on it, was a sleeping Naruto. She narrowed her eyes in the dim light, wondering if she had to wake him so she could go to bed. Her options weren't many and all pointed to, yes, you have to wake him. Here goes nothing. She tried the conventional ways of waking someone, a light tap, a shake of the shoulder, a kick to the foot and even calling his name lightly, but nothing was working. She resorted to shaking his shoulder and yelling his name, which finally had an effect. He stirred, blinked and frowned a little, as though he couldn't quite figure out where he was. He focused his sleepy blue eyes on her and smiled softly, making her squint her eyes in mistrust. He straightened up in the ottoman, stretching himself out, and yawned before getting up. "Oh good, you're finally home." He disarmed her with another grin. His sleep-tousled hair was a distraction she wasn't entirely ready to deal with. "You were waiting for me?" She perked a brow in confusion. He nodded and his fingers gently grabbed her arms, pulling her closer to him. "Wait right here," he said, pointing his finger at her and backing up to his room, slipping inside the darkness like a thief. This was not the reaction she anticipated from him. She expected a stern talking to, a glare, or some angry words. Maybe even the silent treatment, but certainly not that smile that made her heart pitter-patter. He had unsettled her. Again without doing anything, and she decided then and there that she was hopeless and completely infatuated with him. She watched him reappear into the light, his hands hiding behind him with a lopsided grin. What was he up to? "Hinata," he started, his voice holding an uncertainty that made her blink. Was he nervous? "I think we started things a little rough, this morning." Was that a blush creeping on the flesh of his bronzed cheeks? She was seeing things. "So, I hope we can try again, this time maybe." He paused, trying to find better words than, "Let's try again, I promise I won't shove you away in a rage this time," but nothing was coming to mind. "Great, I spent 45 minutes working on this speech only to pass out and forget the whole thing." "Brilliant, Uzumaki. Brilliant." So he did the next best thing. Hinata blinked in confusion when he trailed off and presented her with a strange combination of tulips and a jonquil. He started to blabber on about something but she couldn't quite hear him. She was captured by the meaning of the jonquil. He desired her. She was a bit shocked. What? She whispered, interrupting Naruto's stumble of words and apologies. He looked at her, suddenly worried that she wasn't getting the meaning behind the flowers. She seemed really knowledgeable of the language, considering the careful selection she had picked for the commissioned gardens. I'm apologizing, he said with uncertainty. Maybe he should back away. Her face was unreadable and he was almost positive he'd screwed up again. She tipped her head in confusion and stared at the tulip. She wasn't entirely sure of the meaning behind it since they were meant for lovers. I'm not quite clear with the meaning of the tulip. Could you enlighten me? She asked again, afraid to look at him. She glanced up quickly, but there was a blush tinting her cheeks as she took the jonquil from his hands. She understood that one clearly and he in turn suddenly grew very nervous at his own strange confession. Well, it means, he nearly whispered, but, wanting her to look at him, he tipped her chin towards him. Her gaze met his and she blushed. She could feel the small shake in his hand as he tried to overcome the awkwardness of this moment. She bit her lip as she waited to see what he would say. He smiled softly, which made her breath hitch. Beautiful eyes. She blushed, hard, and felt her heart nearly tip out of her lips when he grinned that sexy smile that made her want to explore his mouth. I'm sorry for today, Hinata, he continued, while maintaining the hold on her chin, his eyes wandering down to her mouth, making her lick them in response, very conscious of the attention. He raised a brow and repressed the urge to smirk. Was she thinking about their kiss from that morning? I was a bit surprised. I didn't expect that you would do that, let alone felt that way, still. She frowned. What do you mean? She breathed out. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. She could tell he had eaten Skittles, the yellow ones. He smelled like lemons and coffee and she relished in the feel of the little goosebumps that formed as he trailed a finger on her jawline. Well, I knew you liked me when I was a kid. His gaze followed his finger. He noted the perfection of her pale skin and could see her heart beating, a little faster than before. Maybe he wasn't too late. Maybe he could fix this. You did. She tried to look away, embarrassed and a little mad about the fact he knew that she was already in love with him back then. Yeah, and I am a little concerned about a few things. He leaned in a little while she looked away. Feeling him moving in, she backed up, out of habit, but her back hit the wall in a soft thump. She pressed her free hand against the barrier and swallowed. Concerned? About what, exactly? She tried to gain control again, but he had moved in quite close. She could feel his body heat and she wasn't sure if it was her heart making that loud thumping noise. She looked a little startled when she felt the tickle of his breath on her neck and turned her face to look at him. She almost fainted as a result. He was so close, their noses almost bumped into each other. She was suddenly very nervous, her heart was going out of control. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was you that wanted me. He moved in again. She could feel his breath, the murmur of his words making her lightheaded. His body grazed her sensually and she closed her eyes without realizing, or if you only liked me because of your memories. She felt a tremor crawl from the base of her back to her head, goosebumps chasing it relentlessly, making her shudder against her will. Do you? He purred out, pushing his luck as he moved in closer, licking his own lips in want. They were not quite touching but the intimacy was so intense she thought she felt his lips. He was tricky, sneaky even, like a fox. Do I, what? She felt suddenly impatient, wanting the discussion to end and to press her lips against his to get this uncertainty over with. Want me as much as I do you, he thought, but it seemed a little too forward. He had to think of something less crass, a little classier, but he couldn't quite put his thoughts in order. Her alluring scent was driving him crazy and he could hear her heart beating wildly. Dizzy and disregarding the anxiety of rejection, Naruto was anticipating her touch. The feel of her skin was intoxicating and he was losing a little bit of control. This was not what he had planned, it was getting a little bit out of hand, but he went with it, she didn't seem to mind. Can we? He grazed her nose with his own, his eyes searching for any rejection on his closeness, but he couldn't find any. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes closed, and she had grabbed onto his shirt, fisting it in her nervousness. She didn't miss him breathing in her scent, and she felt her heart flutter, making her do the same to him. His eyes widened a fraction, and it took everything in him not to crash his mouth down on hers in a searing kiss. Get a hold of yourself. Don't screw this up, he berated himself. Reluctantly, he squeezed his eyes shut and reprimanded his out-of-control hormones. He took another deep breath and repressed the urge to hit his forehead against the wall behind her. Can we try again? He asked her. She licked her lips again, at first uncertain on what he was requesting, but it didn't take long for her to get the hint, and she nodded lightly, her mind a little muddled from the proximity of his body. He pressed himself against her, dropping the tulip as he reached and grabbed her softly by the nape of the neck. His lips grazed her own in a teasing manner that made her toes curl, and she shuddered when his fingers loosened the bun and tangled themselves in her hair. He leaned in, and she could almost taste the lemon of his long-eaten Skittles, the heat of his skin tingling her own, making her whole body feel like it was on fire as she felt his thigh slip between her legs, bringing their bodies closer. Kiss me, kiss me, kiss me, she sang like a mantra inside her mind, and he was more than happy to oblige. He was but mere millimeters from his goal. Hinata, you forgot your purse in the... Oh. They both opened their eyes in surprise and whipped their heads towards the intruder. Hanabi stood there, grinning and laughing deviously, while Hinata blushed to a new shade of red and Naruto cursed openly at his bad luck.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.